Hey everybody. So today we're going to look at some of the factors that made the exploration and colonization of the New World feasible. It's important to realize that the Americas would not have been colonized when they were had these factors not made the concept of expansion attractive to the rulers and merchants of Western Europe. The earliest group of Europeans to come into contact with the New World were the Vikings. They were a group of resourceful seafaring people who lived in Scandinavia in the 9th and 10th centuries. They traded and raided all over Europe, and then they began to establish settlements in the North Atlantic in the 900s. They established a commonwealth in Iceland in 980, and the state of Iceland still exists and is the oldest parliamentary government in the world. Eric the Red founded a colony in Greenland slightly later, and if the Norse stories are correct, Leif the Lucky, or Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, set sail with a crew of 35 Viking warriors to discover the mainland of North American continent in around 1000 AD. The first large-scale exploration of the New World by Europeans was brought about because the Europeans wanted to find an easier way to get to Asia and the East. It was the attraction of the Orient that brought Europeans to America. Europeans were introduced to the luxuries of the Orient during the Crusades, and the result of the First Crusade was that Europeans gained control of the Near East. The Crusaders began to use and enjoy some of the goods that came from the Orient, such as spices, silk, and cotton, and as a result, trade grew up between East and West during this period. But after 1140, the Holy Land was retaken by the Muslims, and the trade routes between Asia and Europe became closed for about 2 centuries. Trade with the East was reopened in the 14th century. This happened because of the explorations of missionaries such as the Franciscans, who knew Persia, India, China, and finally Japan. Some few brave merchant families also began to explore the Far East and set up trade agreements there. The most famous of these families were the Polos, who, in the 13th century, visited the fabulous court of the Great Khan of China. The stories and material that these men brought back to Europe began to revive the East-West trade, which had all but disappeared. By 1400, luxuries of the Orient, silks, precious stones, silver, and gold, as well as such necessities as spices and drugs, were being carried by sea to the head of the Persian Gulf. Here, the materials then began the slow and dangerous journey by camel caravan across the desert into Baghdad and Damascus in Syria. From there, the goods traveled by sea across the Mediterranean into Italy. This growing trade with the Orient had the effect of causing the growth of several Italian city-states. The most notable of these were Venice, Genoa, and Florence. The system of trade that had grown up caused the enrichment of the middlemen who invested in sea trade with the eastern Mediterranean. These Italians became merchant princes, controlling the flow of precious goods from the east to markets in the west. The renewed prosperity of Italian cities triggered the Renaissance in Europe. During the 15th century, the emerging nations of Western Europe, Portugal, Spain, France, and England, became more and more dissatisfied with the trade conditions that forced them to pay high prices to the Italian states for goods from the East. The rulers of these nations wanted to acquire trade goods from the East that would enrich their new states rather than foreign merchants. Several factors that appeared in the late 1400s helped to stimulate this interest. One was knowledge about sources of trade goods in the Orient was brought back to Europe by missionaries and merchants. Another was that improved methods of navigation and ship construction led to greater exploration and more exact geographical information. And a third one was that the growth of trade in Europe and the improvement made in shipping brought about the growth of banking systems. This made it possible to handle and invest large sums of money in the form of credit and then invest in these new trade ventures. These factors first prompted commercial expansion in Portugal and Spain. But soon, almost every advanced Western European nation became involved in the founding of colonies in both the Old and the New Worlds. Portugal was the first nation to establish direct contact with the Far East. Her merchant explorers, trained in the school founded by Prince Henry the Navigator in 1418, traveled down the western coast of Africa. By the beginning of the 16th century, Portuguese explorers had opened trade with India, China, and Japan. In this way, the Portuguese were able to gain a share of the riches that had previously belonged only to the Italian merchant princes. Portugal also traded in Africa, and in 1500 the Portuguese founded a colony in the New World in Brazil. Unlike Portugal, Spain turned her attention to the west rather than the east. This was because of the explorations of Christopher Columbus, who we talked about last time. In 1492, this Italian seaman and geographer became interested in the idea that it should be possible to travel west along the Atlantic Ocean in order to reach the Orient. He tried to sell the idea to the Italian merchant princes, but they were happy with the trade arrangement that they had already had. So he took his idea to Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. They were interested in the idea and were willing to finance his experiment. In this voyage and in 3 succeeding ones, Columbus discovered the Americas and eventually recognized that this was in fact a new world, not the Indies. Soon, other explorers began to seek new lands, or new ways to reach Asia. Competition between Spain and Portugal became threatening to the security of both countries. In order to avoid bloodshed, the Pope established an agreement between the two countries called the Treaty of Tordesillas. Spain was given control of most of the New World. Spain acquired large colonies in the New World through the activities on conquistadors who established colonies in Peru, Mexico, Cuba, Florida, and the American Southwest. By the time that Spain had conquered Mexico, France had become a force in the power of politics of Western Europe. Francis I, the King of France in 1515, served notice that he would not permit the Spanish and Portuguese to divide up the New World among themselves. France wanted a slice of the pie, and the French founded colonies in Canada and in the Great Lakes down the Mississippi into Louisiana and the Caribbean. The Dutch provinces of the Netherlands, which broke away from Spanish control in 1581, preyed on Spanish shipping in the Atlantic and the Portuguese in their Asian and African trading posts. The Dutch grew wealthy off of the spoils of these raids and on Spanish and Portuguese colonies. They had become the legitimate commercial power by the mid-1600s. The New Netherlands Company and the Dutch West India Company sponsored settlements in South America and in the valley of the Hudson River in North America. A decade later, Dutch settlers began to arrive on Manhattan Island. They founded the port town of New Amsterdam, which became New York when the British took the city from the Dutch in 1667. And next time, we'll look more specifically at English expansion.